Right now, there's a shape sitting in the shallow water of a lagoon on an uninhabited island in the middle of the Pacific. It's about 12 meters long, roughly the size of a small aircraft, and it has been sitting in almost the exact same spot in photographs going back to 1938, the year after Amelia Earhart vanished. We live in a world where a satellite can read the license plate on your car from orbit. We can map the floor of the ocean and count trees from space. And we still can't tell you what that shape is. In a few weeks, a team from Purdue University is going to sail more than 800 nautical miles, anchor over it, and pull it out of the water. Either it's a coconut tree that has fooled everyone for 89 years, or it's the most famous missing airplane in history. This is the object nobody has been allowed to touch since the summer Amelia Earhart disappeared. How does the most famous pilot in the world end up as a blurry shape in a lagoon that a major university will spend a year and nearly $1 million trying to reach? It starts with the last thing anyone ever heard her say. On the morning of July 2nd, 1937, Amelia Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan were somewhere over the Pacific, trying to find a speck of land called Howland Island. They had already flown most of the way around the world in a silver Lockheed Electra. This was one of the final legs. A Coast Guard ship, the Itasca, sat anchored off Howland, engines running, waiting to guide them in by radio. And for hours, the crew could hear her. Her voice came through the static, getting stronger, then weaker, then stronger again. But the radio direction finders never locked on. She couldn't hear them, and they couldn't point her to the island. Then, at 8:43 in the morning, the Itasca logged the last words anyone ever confirmed hearing from Amelia Earhart. She said, "We are on the line, 157-337, running north and south." And then the radio went silent for good. Now here's the part almost no one stops to explain. That line, 157-337, wasn't panic. It was a navigation heading, a sun line Noonan had drawn at sunrise. And if you take that heading and follow it southeast, away from Howland, it doesn't run out into open ocean. It runs directly through a scatter of coral atolls called the Phoenix Islands, straight onto one tiny uninhabited island. Back then, it was called Gardner Island. Today, it's called Nikumaroro. The search that summer assumed she went into the sea near Howland, and it looked north and west, out over deep water. Almost nobody looked down the line. Almost nobody. But one man did. 4 days after she disappeared, while the Navy was still searching the open ocean, Amelia's husband, the publisher George Putnam, told reporters he thought the search was in the wrong place. He said he believed his wife and Noonan had come down on a reef in the Phoenix Islands, south of Howland. He was pointing at almost the exact spot the evidence would circle back to for the better part of a century, and at the time, it changed nothing. The Navy did send planes over Gardner Island a week after the disappearance. Pilots from the battleship Colorado flew low over the lagoon on July 9th, and they reported something strange, signs of recent habitation. But they saw no plane and no people, so they moved on. And that detail just sat there for decades. Signs of recent habitation on an island that was supposed to be completely empty. Then it gets stranger, because in the days after she vanished, people started hearing her. Radio operators up and down the Pacific, and as far away as the United States, picked up faint distress calls on Earhart's frequencies. For years, these were dismissed as hoaxes or mistakes. But when researchers at the group called TIGHAR went back and studied all of them decades later, they rated 57 of the 120 reported signals as credible, clustered in the days right after she disappeared, with several bearings that crossed near Gardner Island. And one of those signals is the reason this story haunts people. On an afternoon in July 1937, a 15-year-old girl in Florida named Betty Klenk sat at her father's shortwave radio and began writing down a voice. "A woman," she said, repeating her own name. "This is Amelia Earhart. This is Amelia Earhart." In the background, a man's voice, agitated, sounding hurt, and something about water coming up. The girl filled 3 pages of a notebook before the signal faded. Now, we can't prove that was really her. The notebook only became public decades later, and skeptics have picked at it ever since. But think about what those credible signals would mean if they're real. A radio like that only works if the plane is on land, sitting upright, above the waterline, with a working engine to charge the battery. You cannot send radio calls from the bottom of the ocean. If those signals were Amelia Earhart, then she didn't die when the engines went quiet. She put a crippled plane down on that reef, and she was still alive for days, calling for help that was searching the wrong ocean. So people started looking in the right one, and the island answered. In 1940, a British colonial officer named Gerald Gallagher was working on Gardner Island when islanders showed him something they'd found: a human skull. Gallagher searched the area and recovered a partial skeleton, 13 bones in all, next to the remains of a campfire, with the bones of birds and turtles that someone had been eating. Nearby, a woman's shoe, a man's shoe, and a sextant box, the kind a navigator like Noonan would carry. Gallagher suspected almost immediately that he'd found Amelia Earhart. And this wasn't the first strange thing seen on that shore. 3 months after she disappeared, a British officer named Eric Bevington had photographed the coastline, and in the shallows, just off the reef, something is sticking up out of the water. Years later, imaging analysts studied that shape and concluded it looked like the landing gear of a Lockheed Electra. The bones were shipped off to Fiji for examination. And then 2 things happened. In 1941, a doctor named Hoodless measured them and declared they belonged to a stocky, middle-aged man. And after that, the bones were lost. To this day, nobody knows where they are. For half a century, that was the end of it. A male skeleton, filed away and misplaced. But in 2018, a forensic anthropologist at the University of Tennessee named Richard Jantz went back to the 7 measurements that survived in the old files and ran them through modern forensic software where the 1941 doctor never had. His conclusion was blunt. The bones, he wrote, have more similarity to Earhart than to 99% of individuals in a large reference sample. And he added, until definitive evidence is presented that the remains are not those of Amelia Earhart, the most convincing argument is that they are hers. Now, we have to be honest here, because good evidence cuts both ways. Other anthropologists, like Christina Kilgrove, have pushed back hard. As she points out, the study doesn't confirm the bones were Earhart's, and there are no bones left to test. No skeleton, no DNA, just 7 numbers written down in 1940. It's a strong argument. It is not a body. But the artifacts kept coming. In 2010, searchers digging at that same campsite found the shattered pieces of a small cosmetic jar. Reassembled, it matched the shape of a 1930s American freckle-cream, the kind women use to fade freckles, a product that contained around 11% mercury. Amelia Earhart hated her freckles. At her ticker tape parade in 1928, she pulled off her hat for the crowd and joked, "Here's where I get 60 more freckles on my poor nose." To be fair, even the researchers are careful with this one. The jar they found is clear glass, and the known freckle cream jars are opaque, so it's a maybe, not a match. But stand back and look at the pile. A woman's shoe, a compact, a jar of freckle cream, sitting beside a castaway's fire on an empty island, right on the line of her final radio call. Which raises a dark question. If someone died on that island, where did she go? Why only 13 bones? The answer is one of the eeriest things about this whole place. Nikumaroro has one of the densest populations of the giant coconut crab on Earth. These are not small animals. They grow to 1 meter across, they're strong enough to crack a coconut, and they scavenge anything they can find. Gallagher himself noted at the time that crabs had already scattered many of the bones. Years later, researchers ran a grim experiment. They left a pig carcass on the island and watched what happened. The crabs stripped it down in about 2 weeks, and they dragged the bones as far as 60 feet away into the brush, where some were never found again. So if a woman died on that reef, the island itself would take her apart and carry the pieces off into the dark. Which is exactly why, nearly 90 years later, we're still standing over a shape in the water instead of a grave. Before we get to the part where this whole theory gets challenged, one quick thing. If a mystery that's gone unsolved for almost 90 years is the kind of story you want more of, take a second to subscribe. And if you're watching this on your TV, you can hit the like button and subscribe right there with your remote. It genuinely helps us keep making these. All right, back to the island, because not everyone is convinced by any of this. And the doubters are not lightweights. In 1919, Robert Ballard, the man who found the wreck of the Titanic, brought a full deep-water expedition to Nikumaroro. He put remotely operated vehicles down the underwater slopes around that reef and searched for the plane. And he came back with nothing tied to Earhart. He still said the radio evidence was compelling and that you can't take it off the table. But the ocean floor there was empty. Then there's Ric Gillespie, who has spent more than 30 years arguing that Amelia Earhart died on this exact island. He is the last person who'd want to talk you out of it. And when he looks at this new satellite object, the shape everyone is getting excited about, he says it's very clearly a tree. Everybody wants the airplane, he says. The airplane is gone. He thinks it washed off the reef and was pounded to pieces in the surf within days. When the man who most wants it to be the plane tells you it's a tree, you slow down and listen. And then there's a completely different camp, the people who think this island is a fantasy. The late Elgen Long spent decades arguing the simplest answer is the right one. She ran out of fuel near Howland, went into deep water, and sank. And everything else is wishful thinking. Long had a line about the whole argument that's hard to forget. "You'll never convince true believers that they aren't right," he said. "You're just confusing them with facts." And there's one more version, the one the official story never wanted. Not everyone in Earhart's own family believed she died on a reef at all. Her mother, Amy, went to her grave convinced her daughter was on a secret government mission and had been captured by the Japanese and taken to the Marshall Islands. As reported in the Los Angeles Times back in 1949, her mother said she was certain there was a government mission involved, that Amelia had not gone down in the ocean, that she'd landed on a tiny atoll and been picked up by a Japanese boat. A whole theory grew up around that idea, that the United States knew what really happened and buried it. Historians have never found the documents to back it up, and a famous photo that supposedly showed Earhart in Japanese custody turned out to have been taken before she ever left. But the belief has never fully died, and the reason it won't is simple. The real answer never came. So we have 3 stories and 1 island, which brings us back to that shape in the lagoon. And here's the strange thing about it. It has not always been there. When researchers went back through years of satellite pictures of Nikumaroro, the object appears in 2015, right after Cyclone Pam, one of the most violent storms ever recorded in the South Pacific, with winds near 165 miles per hour, came through and scoured the sediment off the lagoon floor. For a while, something about 12 meters long, close to the length of Earhart's Electra, sat exposed and slightly reflective in the shallow water. The team behind the expedition says the same shape even turns up faintly in aerial photos of the island going back to 1938. but it was Cyclone Pam that finally scrubbed away the sediment and made it clear. And then, season by season, the sand crept back and buried it again. The man who first noticed it wasn't a scientist. He was a retired U.S. Navy officer named Michael Ashmore, who was zooming around an Apple Maps image of the island one day and stopped on a shape that didn't look natural. Which brings us to the question everyone asks the second they hear this story. If we can see it on a map, why can't we just zoom in closer and settle it? And the answer is that water breaks the rules. A satellite that can read a license plate on dry pavement goes nearly blind, looking through a few feet of moving, cloudy, sediment-filled water. The surface bends and smears whatever is under it. The detail collapses the deeper you look, and a thin layer of sand sitting on top of a metal surface erases its shape completely. From orbit, a buried fuselage and a waterlogged tree trunk look almost identical. That's not a cover-up. That's physics. The only way to know what that shape is to put human beings directly on top of it. But two doubts have to clear before anyone gets excited. Could she have even reached that island? And could anything of the plane still be there after all these decades? On the fuel, this is genuinely argued. Nikumaroro sits about 350 nautical miles down that sun line from Howland. Gillespie's own estimate is that if Earhart managed her fuel the way her engineers recommended, she'd have reached the line with maybe 5 hours of flying left, more than enough to get there. But he's the first to say there's no way to know if she actually did in. And the crash and sank camp is just as certain the tanks were already dry. Nobody can prove it either way. And as for what survives, aluminum in warm salt water pounded against a coral reef does not stay a plane. If anything is down there, the people going don't expect a cockpit sitting on the sand. They expect fragments. An engine, landing gear, torn panels, the confetti of an aircraft, half buried in sediment where the currents finally dropped it, which happens to be exactly what a dredge is built to uncover. Which brings us to what is actually about to happen. In the first week of October 2026, a team of 16 people leaves the Amelia Earhart terminal at Purdue University Airport, flies to the island nation of Kiribati, and boards a ship in the capital, Tarawa. From there, it's roughly 830 nautical miles of open ocean to Nikumaroro, and they'll have only a handful of days on site once they arrive. They'll run sonar and magnetometers across the object first, and then bring in a hydraulic dredge to clear away the sediment and finally see what's underneath it. If that dredge turns up aluminum with the rivet pattern of an Electra, this stops being a theory. The plan after that is to come back in 2027 to excavate the site properly and eventually bring whatever they find back home. And there's a reason it's Purdue sailing out there. Amelia Earhart worked at Purdue. Purdue helped buy her that Electra, the very plane she vanished in, and she always intended to bring it back to the university once the flight around the world was done. She never got the chance. Now the institution she left behind is going out to try and finish the trip for her. As one of the men leading the expedition put it, this is the story of a legacy and the story of a mystery. For 89 years, this has been a story with no last page. The plane sank, they said, and that was supposed to be the end of it. But the heading she read out over the radio pointed here. Her husband pointed here, 4 days later. The bones a British officer pulled out of the sand in 1940 pointed here. The shoe, the fire, the little jar of freckle-cream, all of it sat here, on one strip of empty coral in the middle of nowhere. And now, for the first time since 1937, someone is finally going to reach into that lagoon and put their hands on the answer. Maybe it really is a tree, and the search goes on the way it has for almost a century. Or maybe, this October, a woman who flew off the edge of the map finally comes home. Either way, we'll be watching the moment that ship drops its anchor. And when it reaches the island, and we finally learn what has been lying in that water all this time, that is the next thing we'll bring you, right here,